Okay, the Great Depression and the New Deal, part 3. I think we're on part 3. Make sure you are paying attention for these terms and make sure that you can do these action items. So the stock market crash signaled the end of the boom times and the beginning of the hard times. As investors mourned their losses, Americans watched the economy stagger into the Great Depression. In the cities and on the farms, desperate poverty gripped the nation. Even after prosperity returned, those who lived through the crisis would remember the pain and worries of the Depression. Tested by extreme hardship, this generation of Americans forged a character that will be strong enough, was strong enough, and will strong enough to overcome economic ruin and restore prosperity. Whew. Okay. How many millions of people lost their jobs between 1928 and 1933? Many millions of people, correct. During which years did unemployment increase most? So when do you see the sharpest increase in unemployment? In cities and towns across the nation, Americans faced a terrible plight. The numbers of the unemployed, homeless, and hopeless increased like a casualty list in some great war. In rural America, people fared no better. In fact, sometimes their conditions was even worse. Farmers had been suffering even before the Great Depression. Falling commodity prices and accumulating debt had made it a struggle for farmers to keep their heads above water. Many failed to stay afloat and sank so deep that they lost their farms. And, we talked about there not being any sort of safety net for the market. It would just free fall. There's also not any safety net for farmers. And so this is going to be a conversation that comes out of the Great Depression is how do we support farmers? If they are an indicator of economic success, how do we help them be economically successful? Here is some example of commodity price drops. Why did commodities, these are things that you buy. So why did commodity prices fall after 1919, even though the Great Depression was years away? So you start to see a fall in commodity prices. The commodity price fall really signals the coming of the Depression and doesn't come after the Depression. Here's some dairy farmers. It says dairy farmers poured out their milk as part of a 1932 protest. What can you infer about the price farmers received for milk in 1932? And it would be that it wasn't worth the sale of the milk, right? It wasn't worth the work that went into, gathering the milk, harvesting the milk, milking the milk. But here they are pouring it out. Okay, we're going to talk about the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl is caused by several factors, one of which is wind erosion. It says, which two states appear to have been hardest hit by erosion, and what is unusual about California's location compared to other destinations? So think about where they are going when farmers are leaving the Dust Bowl areas. So the Dust Bowl. Combined with severe drought, how did the planting of wheat lead to the loss of topsoil and the dust storms? We're gonna get there, I promise. But you can see the number of dust storms in the plain, the amount of wheat harvested. What's happening is that the soil is being completely stripped. Let me go back. The soil out west is being completely stripped due to a combination of erosion, fed by drought, fed by the continuing to overplant crops such as wheat. If you are overplanting during the time of drought, when drought hits, it's going to cause greater erosion. And those are the perfect storm, that perfect storm of conditions that's going to lead to the Dust Bowl. And when the Dust Bowl hits, farmers move. You might have heard of the Grapes of Wrath, about the John Steinbeck's book about the farmer family that travels to California in search of opportunity. That's the Dust Bowl. Notice that they're traveling to California here. Many others are traveling to other areas, but staying in the West. California is pretty far away, but many people do travel that way. All of the black dots represent destination of migrants, and then the purple circle is the Dust Bowl area. One of the ironies, and we're going to talk more about the Dust Bowl in a folder activity shortly. One of the ironies of the Depression was the word itself. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, an economic slump was called a panic or a crisis. President Hoover used the word depression to describe the state of affairs because he thought it sounded less severe than the other terms. But before long, Hoover's depression gave way to the Depression and then the Great Depression. The term described not only a state of mind, but also an economic reality. It showed a despondent America, filled with people overwhelmed by seemingly inescapable poverty. Not only did the Depression make victims of men and women who lost jobs, it was also an economic and emotional crisis that profoundly affected U.S. society. From big cities to farms and small towns, the Great Depression spread misery far and wide across America. The unemployed and the homeless crowded into shanty towns. Giant dust storms swallowed the Great Plains. As the crisis deepened, Herbert Hoover struggled to respond to the nation's problems. In 1932, as a result of Hoover's cautious and failed response, Americans would turn to a new leader who called for increased government intervention to try to stop the Depression. Do you guys know who that is? FDR. He was called a socialist by a lot of people because his policies were so different and involved so much more government involvement than had happened before. So these are two kids in a shanty town in Washington, D.C. Think about, what do the signs in the photo tell you about how the poor perceive the government's role in the economic crisis? It says, hard times are still hoovering over us, right? Hoover's Poor Farm Tobacco Fund. So they do blame the president for their situation, and they do think that the president should be doing more. So supply side or trickle-down economics is a theory that plays out differently based on economic circumstances. In theory, think about how trickle-down economics would generate economic growth. I referenced trickle-down economics last time, or trickling down, and so I thought that it might be a good idea to explain what that is. In supply-side or trickle-down economics, you have businesses and the wealthy at the very top of the chain here, and they're going to receive tax breaks. And in theory, those tax breaks would allow businesses and top earners to increase investment. New investment would stimulate growth and provide new jobs, and increase employment would raise consumer spending, which would further stimulate economic growth. In practice, and in times like these, you really sort of stop with the first line. Businesses and top earners receive tax breaks. Those tax breaks don't always go back into the economy in the way that the government may hope that they would. Unemployment is going to skyrocket. A fourth of Americans are out of work by 1933. You see bread lines where people are lining up for food, usually given out by religious organizations. And you also see the establishment of Hoovervilles. We saw those two little kids, and the caption describes them as living in a shanty town. The more sort of historically accurate description would have been a Hooverville. So people who lost their homes and are essentially living in these tent cities, and they started to call them Hoovervilles, which is a sign that Hoover is not doing well. And you can see there's a picture of a Hooverville down there in the bottom right. The conditions are pretty tragic. Things are pretty sad, but people had no other options. And there are Hoovervilles all over the country that pop up overnight. There are also, you see, the rise of hobos, which is a specific type of homeless individual who rides the rails, and they would go from town to town riding railroad cars, hoping to find work. Let's see. Repatriation and forced deportations. So specifically out west, you see a lot of Mexican Americans, even people who were born in this country, being rounded up and taken to Mexico because of this immigrant fear and this hatred of immigrants that sweeps the nation during this time period. A lot of people blamed immigrants, quote unquote, taking our jobs. But it was immigrants, people new to the country, but also people who had lived here and been born here. But if they looked like they weren't from here, many of them were forcibly deported. And then we've mentioned the Dust Bowl, and we'll be mentioning it more. This is an image. When I say everything was dusty, there were windstorms, the soil was eroded. That's what it looked like. People had to flee their homes.
This fall on PBS. They had come to the far edge of the Great Plains in search of a new beginning, in the last place in America where a family could claim a homestead and build a future.
We had the best crop that we had had in 1929, and everything was looking up.
A sea of grass, once the domain of Indians and buffalo, disappeared beneath the blade of a plow.
I saw the whole country transformed in the sunset glow. All the brown prairie turned to gold.
But then it was as if the land rejected them. The rains stopped and the winds came.
We saw this cloud coming in, black dirt. And I'll never forget my grandmother. She said, "You kids run and get together. The end of the world's coming."
It came like a black wall, a tide of destruction that crashed over the broken plains, choking the life out of everything in its path.
You never really escaped the dust. It always found its way in. And that's, I think, what drove people crazy.
Some would pull up stakes and move on, but most stayed, always looking to the promise that next year would be better.
We were just too selfish and we were trying to make money, and it didn't work out.
Ken Burns tells the story of a generation that was buried and what it took to dig out. The Dust Bowl starts Sunday, November 18th at 8.
You can watch that on Netflix if you're interested in watching the whole thing, but I think even just that preview gives us a really good understanding and some really good imagery there of what the Dust Bowl was. There were some more pictures of Hoovervilles, the conditions that people found themselves in. Okay, the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army is comprised of veterans who essentially march on Washington because they are upset and frustrated with the economic conditions that they find themselves in. And they had been promised in World War I that they would be given a bonus however many years later, and they want their bonuses early. And so they march on Washington to demand their bonuses. They don't get them, and they set up this tent city. It looks horrible. Then they're forcibly removed. It's a bad look all around for Hoover.
In 1932, Washington was under siege. The capital was surrounded by over 10,000 unemployed veterans of World War I from all over the country. Their only assets were the bonus certificates they'd been given after the war, which promised a cash bonus sometime in the future. They needed it now.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945. What brought you to Washington? Well, to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it. I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me. This is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism.
President Hoover was left to deal with the veterans when the Senate rejected their demands. The marchers had stayed, camped out in central Washington.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. And I had a press card, so I passed the police lines, and then I saw the soldiers advancing into the camp. And when confronted with this, the men all stood there and said, "Stand firm as long as you can." And they started throwing tear gas. I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there. I was thinking of Herbert Hoover when this happened, because his election was in 3 months. I thought this would be the finish of Hoover.
The orders of the president must be obeyed. And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the capital of the United States of America.
So again, not good for Hoover, and you heard him say that he thought that this would be the end of Hoover, and largely it was. Hoover believed in this idea of rugged individualism, that it was on you to improve your own situation and not on the government to help you. Publicly, Hoover was talking about how things were going to be fine, but privately, he was extremely concerned. He actually did attempt public works projects very similar to FDR's public works projects, but Congress doesn't have an appetite to do anything like that yet, and he isn't willing to spend enough money, right? He's not willing to spend the money that it's going to require to put people back to work. He will do some things. He will establish a national credit corporation. He will establish a reconstruction finance corporation and an emergency relief and construction act. So a lot of people say Hoover did nothing. It's not that he did nothing. He just didn't do enough. And I wouldn't argue that he did do enough. What I would argue is that he wasn't, I think he's often cast as a villain who purposefully caused the Great Depression or purposely didn't do anything about it. He did try, but he was unwilling to sort of expand the traditional role of the government in a way that it was really necessary. And there are political consequences for that. So as the congressional elections of 1930 approach, a lot of Americans start to feel that the party in power is to blame. This is the midterm elections. Republicans are going to lose 49 seats, as well as their majority in the House of Representatives. So it's a sign, the midterm elections are a sign that trouble is coming. So it says, from the Oval Office, Hoover worked hard to end the Great Depression, but to many out-of-work Americans, the president became a symbol of failure. Some people blamed capitalism, while others questioned the responsiveness of democracy. Many believed the American system was due for an overhaul. In 1928, Herbert Hoover had almost no chance of losing his bid for the presidency. However, in 1932, he had almost no chance of winning. With unemployment nearing 25%, people's savings wiped out by bank failures, long lines at soup kitchens, stomachs grumbling from hunger, and the number of homeless increasing every day, the Depression had taken its toll. Most Americans felt that their president had failed completely, and they were ready for a change. In July of 1932, the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for president. And again, we won't have a Republican president until Nixon. To be continued.